Cake. Oh, that's so clunky. Hello, everybody.
We need
Welcome.
a pre-cake.
We need a pre-cake. The pre-cake cake. Oh, look at that. That's amazing. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast.
You're very blue today for some reason.
I know. I have my tint, but it's like.
Is that what that is? You have
I will feel like Thanos over here. I mess it. Oh wow!
Now, what are you adjusting here? You have there you go.
Wow! I feel like I'm in a police lineup. Yeah, I have a little like color fob in front of my thing just to give a little contrast. Just give a little something. But if I'm looking a little too purple, maybe I need to turn it down. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the podcast. This is our third week with our new co-host, Steve Conley. If this is your first time joining in, one of our general catchphrases is, well, hello. Welcome to the podcast. Pencil to Pencil is a weekly live podcast where expert cartoonists talk to each other and you get to watch. How cool is that? I'll introduce myself and then my buddies. I'm Jamar Nicholas, Philadelphia native, and also a scholastic author. My newest book, Leon the Extraordinary, will be out in October. Please go pick it up. I am joined at the proverbial hip by my best bud and Master Chief of Comic Books, Mike Manley. Say hi, Mike.
Hey, everybody.
Mike, what's new with you?
Let's see. Oh, I had a bad case of just starting to get over bad case of pink eye.
Really?
Yeah, I can't figure out how I got it, but it was really quite painful.
Yeah.
Figured when I must have gotten it when I went to the doctor's office or something, because that's where, or at the pharmacy where like somebody probably had pink eye and they
wait. You got pink eye at the doctor?
Right? Yeah, and so that's not easy to draw with.
No,
like squinting your one eye the whole time.
Did you put, what is it? Steve knows everything. What is it in a tea bag? There's something that's good.
No, there's no tea bag. You have to take antibiotics.
Is it tannin?
Tannin, yes, Biff Tannen. Yeah, Biff Tannen. That's exactly.
Some absorbing Junior on my eye.
That's fantastic. Thanks,
but
Mike.
Other than that, the usual grind of being a newspaper strip cartoonist.
And also to that effect, our good buddy Steve Conley, who's joining us in the third chair.
I'm coming over a touch of the gout, but apart from that, I don't know where I got it from.
For real, you got gout? Yeah, we're getting old, you guys.
You got the
Mike's pharmacist.
That's not good, you guys. We got to do better.
My name is Steve Conley.
Well, maybe he got it because of our guests tonight.
I'm a cartoonist of the webcomic The Middle Age, which you could read at middleagecomic.com, and it's on Webtoons and Tapas and all that stuff.
Oh, wow. That's very fantastic, Steve.
And you've been doing those sculptures, those awesome.
Yeah. Tell us more about your 3D sculpture stuff you're doing on your iPad.
There's a program on the iPad called Nomad Sculpt. I'm a novice sculptor, and it's great. If you haven't tried sculpting and you're a cartoonist, give it a whirl. It's a lovely program. Check out my channel here on YouTube. If you're on the YouTubes, if you go to youtube.com/Steve Conley Art, or if you go to twitch.tv/Steve Conley, you can find me Tuesdays and Thursdays making 3D models and drawing comics.
That's fantastic.
So you're working on the duck now, right?
Yep. Each one of these, they're going to be D&D minis. This is a larger print that I had made.
Let me give you the screen. We need to see that.
Oh no, you get more of my gigantic noggin. But
look at that! Look at that!
This is a character from my webcomic, and it was all created. The sculpture was done on an iPad and just 3D printed by a vendor. And they're going to be D&D size minis. So look for those with a Kickstarter later this month.
So will you paint those?
What's that? No, I'm not going to. I'm not a. I wasn't a sculptor, so maybe I'm a painter. We'll find out.
I mean, but is that something that people would do with that? Would they paint it?
Yeah. They for all the people who play like tabletop games like Warhammer and D&D, they get their minis and then they paint them.
Yeah, that's. Oh, and Tim Fielder just says, "Do you use Nomad?" Oops.
Yep. Yeah.
That's exactly what you use. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So guys, I don't want to belay the inevitable, but if this is your first time, what happens here is, like I said, us cartoonists talk shop, and from time to time we have guests, and we have some fantastic ones in the building. But hold on, wait a minute, we're not ready. We got another special guest who just rang the doorbell. Let's bring him in. Where's my thing? Let's bring him in. Let's try to get. What?
There he
Hey, Brett.
Hi, how are you?
Brett Blevins, as I live and breathe. How are you, sir?
I've been pretty hectic, but all right. How about you guys? Well, I heard some of that just now. I was setting up. I actually have to leave at about 5:30 tomorrow morning to catch a 6 o'clock shuttle to the airport. So
Okay.
it'll be an early morning for me, but I'm flying to Washington to see my granddaughter.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Give her my love. It's
I
great
will.
to see. It's great to see you, Brett. I haven't seen you in a couple months, so it's great to have the gang all here. Mike, why don't you introduce our guest? Because I've been running my mouth.
Well, I don't think these guys really need much of an introduction to anybody who's been a fan of quality comic book art for the past 40 years, probably at this point. Tom, yeah, and I thought I would ask both of them together, Tom Yeates and Mark Schultz, who both produce Prince Valiant for King Features, and being a newspaper cartoonist who does a legacy strip like that, I thought that would be great. Mark is also known for, writing and drawing his own strip or book, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. And then we all, for Brett, Tom and Mark and myself, all spent a lot of time with Al Williamson. And that, in fact, that's how I got to meet both Mark and Tom years ago, back when Al had his studio in Honesdale, and Brett was there. He was already sharing Al's studio, so I thought, well, it's sort of a nice sort of like connections episode,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I thought I'd ask both of them to come on, because there's not, I mean, outside of Flash Gordon, which they don't do anymore, I think Prince Valiant is the oldest adventure strip because it predates the Phantom.
Wow.
Right? Phantom started in 1936. So I don't remember when, but we can ask them when.
Yeah, we can ask them.
And Hal Foster drew his last Sunday page in 1970, I believe. So the strip ran for many years with John Cullen Murphy. And for a while, Foster still did layouts, I think until around 1980. But we can ask, again, another question we can ask them. So I just thought, there's not that many people around that do that type of work anymore that's still in, coming out regularly, I mean, that strip has never stopped. So, and I think it's also fascinating to pick people's brains. There's a lot of legacy strips in the comic strips now.
Yeah.
A lot of sons and daughters and assistants taken over the decades, and they're not launching new strips, and certainly not really launching new adventure strips.
Yeah.
So I think and it's also, I mean, I'm sure a privilege to be able to work on such a classic, maintain the classic strip like that.
LG says it was old when I discovered it. Well, this is going to be a legacy episode, and I'm very excited about it. I want to dance for a little bit more because Tom got up from his chair. He's not here yet. So I'll give some rules of engagement, and then here he is. He's good. So tonight we're just going to shoot the breeze. If you have a question, please type it into the chat. I'm going to do my best to get it on if it fits our conversation. If it doesn't get on, please don't be sad. Remember what my mom said this? I don't know if your mom said this. You get what you get and you don't get upset. All right.
Then she ate all the
all the children.
That's right.
All right, guys. Welcome to Pencil to Pencil. Tom Yates and Mark Schultz. Woohoo. Oh, no, I'm not ready. All right. Woohoo. Boom.
Wow. What a full screen.
We got a full house. Let me work with the format. Is that good? Or no, this is good. This feels
That's
good.
better, yeah.
That feels good. All right. Somebody get started and then I'll go to the chat and see what's going on.
Well, hey guys, I'm glad you both agreed to come on the podcast. And as I was saying before we went on, a lot of people were really excited to hear that both of you were coming on the show. And I was excited because there's not that many of us doing, like I was saying in the just a little bit ago, that are doing the classics. There's not that many classics running. Like a lot of the older strips stopped. 3G stopped, Mandrake stopped, Flash Gordon stopped. So why don't you guys sort of tell the audience how you came into working on Prince Valiant and working together? Did you both start at the same time? Did one start before the other?
I think that's a cue for Mark to jump in here. You're in the spotlight, brother. Sorry.
Okay. I'll get the ball rolling. I came on board in 2004. For decades after Hal Foster retired, John Cullen Murphy, Cullen Murphy wrote the scripts, and they brought on, I don't remember the exact year, but maybe around 2000, John Cullen Murphy brought on Gary Gianni to assist with his doing breakdowns essentially. And when John Cullen Murphy retired in, I think it was early 2004 or late 2003, and died shortly after, Gary took over the reins on the strip. And the son, Cullen Murphy, wasn't really interested in continuing without his father. You know, he was ready to move on to other things. An extraordinarily talented man. I mean, he writes, he knows medieval history, and he writes and edits, or he did edit for the Atlantic magazine, amongst other things. Wrote a great book called Cartoonist Country that's about his life growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut, and all the illustrators and cartoonists who lived in that area. But anyway, I was invited to send some sample story ideas into King. Jay Kennedy was the editor at the time. And I guess they liked what they saw, because between Gary, promoting me, he, again, like my relationship with Thomas over here, Gary and my relationship was, we're on the same page. All three of us are kind of interested in similar types of storytelling and adventure fiction. And so it was a nice transition working with Gary, and I worked with Gary for, I think it was 8 years. And when Gary was ready to move on, again, this guy over here took over the strip, and from my point of view, it's been smooth sailing ever since. I got the easy part of the job. I get to write 100 Hun swordsmen come rocketing over the cliff, and and the defenders of Camelot are waiting to meet them, and Thomas has to actually draw that.
Well, how did I get started on all this? Like Mark says, I'm a longtime fan of this kind of sub-genre of the whole comic book world, whole comics world. Got into Hal Foster when I was in high school long ago, and was always trying to figure out how the hell he drew pictures like that, and I kind of still am trying to figure that out. And that's probably part led me to being friends with Williamson. And Williamson actually called me in the 90s and said, I want you to meet Murphy, because he was friends with John Cullen Murphy, and Murphy was looking for somebody to help him out. And Al pointed him at me, which would have been really smart for me to have done that, but I was distracted. I was working on Tarzan comics, which I'd always wanted to do, and so I didn't quite give it the college try to get that assistant job from Murphy, which I regretted afterwards. But then, lo and behold, in 2011, I think it was, I'm sitting at the San Diego Comic-Con drawing sketches, including I had just done a sketch of Prince Valiant for Collector Buddy, which is what I would do at these conventions to help supplement income. Don't tell anybody else out there, but the comic book business doesn't always pay a hell of a lot. And especially if you're like to do really elaborate, complicated pictures that take days and days to finish one page. But anyway, so yeah, they came up to me. Brendan Burford was the editor, and he was dressed real nicely, a suit and a tie, close cropped hair and beard, much younger than me. And he's standing there in front of my table as everybody's walking by and stuff. And I had a whole bunch of originals that I had drawn previous to that. I had been illustrating myths and legends for Learner Publications kids books. So they weren't marketed to the comic book world through that medium. They were marketed to schools and libraries, which was fine with me. And so anyway, I had just done Robin Hood and William Tell and 2 King Arthur little thin 48-page graphic novels, and I had the originals for sale. And so, Brandon was just standing there looking at my stuff, and I was busy drawing, and he said, excuse me, Mr. Yeates. And I look up, and he said, how would you like to draw Prince Valiant? And I kind of speechless there, which is unusual for me. So that's how I came. And of course I said, yeah, baby.
And did he take his sword out and knight you?
He didn't. I was very disappointed. I really was expecting that, but
yeah.
Anyway, we had to do some tryouts, as I recall. Mark cooked up, and I was good friends with Mark, and I knew Gary, and in fact, I had just gone over to Gary's booth, I think, and picked up one of his Prince Valiant collections that he had printed. He printed some up himself, where they go. It was a story where they go to the underworld, and he meets the little people and has this great Lord of the Rings little mini adventure in the underworld. So which I just loved. Land of Shadows, maybe it's called. And I had just picked it up from Gary, and here comes this guy, and so that's how I got hired. And like I say, Mark cooked up a 4-Sunday tryout for me, because he said, even though I think you're going to get the job, we got to go through this technical, audition. So I passed the audition, fortunately.
Yeah. I think that's it's funny how it's still sort of a small circle, because there's comic strips and then comic books. And in comic strips, it's actually a smaller circle than comic books, because the people that can do the type of illustrative stuff is much smaller in comic strips. also, there's a lot of people who could draw 5 weeks of Prince Valiant, but they couldn't draw 52 weeks of Prince Valiant. And they couldn't draw 110 weeks of Prince Valiant. You know, that's one of the really remarkable things about people like Foster or Charles Schultz. You know, somebody who could actually do one thing all of their mature adult life until retirement. And it's probably almost impossible for people to do that now because the world of cartooning is such a different environment. I mean, going back to what you were talking about, John Cullen Murphy Jr. or the guy who wrote the
writer. Yeah, the son who's a writer. Yeah.
I bought that book, and he said what his father made in like 1962, and I did the calculation. So, all right, Prince Valiant was never like Blondie, which was always like the top, or Peanuts, or Dick Tracy, were in a lot more papers. But adjusting for today's money, he was making $250,000 a year drawing Prince Valiant.
Right. Drawing and writing it adjusted to today's income.
Right. And your dollar bought a heck of a lot more in 1961 than it does now, you know? So those guys all lived pretty darn good.
Yeah. He was writing and drawing and coloring and everything. Yeah. Pretty much. His shop was. I believe he had assistants, I believe, but
right. And he was, I don't remember if he was still doing Big Ben Bolt when he stopped doing that, but I know Al did a couple of weeks of Big Ben Bolt back in the day.
Yeah. And Angelo Torres did a bunch of them, I think, too.
Yeah.
I'd like to see those. I'd like to figure out what years they were and check out the ones that those guys worked on. And I mean, they probably still basically look like Murphy's, but
I do. But yeah, I've seen a couple of the ones that Al did. The one thing you could always tell, even when Al worked with John Prentice and he was like maybe laying out stuff, his layouts were always more dynamic than Prentice. So I have a bunch of Prentice dailies, and there's one I'm sure that it's Al, because it doesn't look like any other John Prentice daily you have ever seen. You know, the way everything is staged.
I love Prentice's work. I got a collection. It was later. It was after Al worked for him that I bought one of the reprints, the IDW reprints, and it's really well written and well drawn and really top notch stuff. You know, but you're right. Al's layout is more innovative and sort of grabs you a little bit more. He's got something else going on sometimes. Even when he's just kind of phoning it in, it would still had this strength to it.
Yeah, Al, no one's been better in the comic industry at the illusion of movement. He really had that. It's still a still image, but and I think it has to do with him watching movies, serial movies, fight scenes over and over as a kid. But he captured that in a single image, the impression that there was a real dynamic movement happening.
Right.
Sometimes he's doing it mostly with the background shapes too. He can the whole panel's alive. Yeah.
I also was impressed that Al knew when to stop drawing, you know, to simplify. He would have something very naturalistic in a human figure and clothing, but then, like Brett says, the background could be very simplified just to increase that sense of motion. It was abstracted. He knew when to stop drawing.
Yeah. The negative space, the empty areas.
Yeah. In fact, he and Frazetta were that's one thing they really had in common. I mean, Al was more naturalistic, I suppose, but maybe more influenced by, like, Al would not cut people's legs off like Frazetta. Like Frazetta would I like that shape. Okay, he won't have a left leg, you know. But they both were really good with the abstract part of the layout, which is something that you don't always think about when you're younger because you're obsessed with drawing the figures. You want to draw the cool figures, and you don't always think like, well, the background is also a figure. The background is very important. And Al was great on those reprints in Corrigan. You could see where he would one of the things I picked up on Judge Parker actually from him was how the way he placed the balloons and would knock out panel borders would increase the amount of white space on the page. Like if you just border everything, it contains it. But if you take the word balloons and you take the border off where the balloon touches the top or the bottom, it just opens the space right up. And that's something I noticed that he did all the time on Corrigan.
I think that was a natural gift that he had because he was so brilliant at that even at BC when he was 20 years old. When you look at that Sound of Thunder, there is so much copy in every one of those panels, but he makes it breathe so beautifully. Yeah. Sometimes there's just this tiny little bit of drawing at the bottom of this long block of copy.
Yeah. I think that Feldstein forced Al to figure out how to deal with that massive blocks of copy. And I love that about him. And I copied that from him from when I first saw his work. And I remember doing a job real early at DC Comics where somebody in production finished the drawing. They didn't realize that it was supposed to end there. And it was just a panel. I went, oh, well. So, and I had to teach our letterer, colorist, the very talented Scott Roberts, how to do the balloons that way, or the captions, because there's no balloons in Prince Valiant.
Right.
It's captions. But I would just make the whole panel smaller, right? The part where the drawing has an outline, the panel border, and you just make it smaller. And then you have the empty space above, you fit the caption in, and the caption doesn't have a box around it. It's just floating there. And it just helps so much, exactly like you're saying, Mike. I hadn't really thought of it the way you explained it, but that's exactly why I am so drawn to that. It adds more white to a very busy, complicated story with, the whole Saxon army coming over the hill while all of Camelot and its various, engines of war are staging, in the same scene and all that. You got to have some empty space somewhere.
Right. But do you guys, the old days, the strip was the whole page, and we're like half tier now. And do you have the thing where you have to have the drop tier, or there's some art that's cut off? I don't know if that happens on Prince Valiant, if you guys are a little bit different.
Well, we do have that. Yes, we do have that. I'll just leave it at that. We have a drop panel. It's a title panel, and it hopefully prevents the different newspapers and the different subcontractors that produce the comic sections that go into the extra features with the advertisements and all that stuff, and the mechanics of how newspapers are created. When they print Prince Valiant, they won't stretch it or squeeze it because there's a drop panel. And if Prince Valiant doesn't fit the shape, whatever it is, in their paper, then they can use the drop panel instead of having to, stretch it out or, make it. Anyway, it was pretty complicated. I wasn't happy with the way it was being laid out when I came on. When I came on, I had 4 other jobs green-lighted right before that I'd been waiting to start for years, and they all got green-lighted at the same time. And it was really nuts. It was really nuts the first 2 years. And so it was just everything I could do to do that one page a week on top of the other stuff. and I hired people to help me, particularly with the other work. And I was really fortunate in some of that, particularly because Michael William Kaluta helped me on one of the other jobs. And so anyway, after a year and a half or so of dealing with this weird layout, I had got some of those other jobs out of the way, and I thought, okay, I got to wrap my brain around this formatting issue. And I came up with the title panel, basically because Hagar the Horrible, was right next to me in the paper, has a title panel, and I'm going, well, if you take your title panel out, then you can blow that up or shrink it down into different shapes. Or if you have it, then same thing. So anyway, that kind of helped. And yes, so that's long answer to your question.
No. I mean, I think this is all really fascinating because fans don't really have any idea how the hot dogs are made. They don't have no idea. I learned the same thing when I started out, which is the middle tier is always the same. There's two big panels on Judge Parker, but the top tier and the bottom tier, you can make the panels different sizes or whatever. And the top tier, on some papers it was carried, some papers it wasn't carried. And I remember Evelyn, our old editor, said they always have to default to the newspapers that have the oldest presses and still run stuff like like you have new papers and new presses, and they're using digital stuff, and then you have these old people that are still running the old 4-color Heidelberg presses and Treetop Kentucky, and you've got it. They've got they're still getting Prince Valiant, or they're still getting Judge Parker, and it has to work for the way they run it on their press. And I seem to remember, you guys might remember too, that even in the old days, I think Steve Canyon and some of the other strips would have the strip where you would have part of that logo panel had extra art on it that they could use or could cut.
Yeah, the drop panel.
Yeah, the drop panel, but there was extra art on it that they could use or they could cut.
Yeah, that did when Al was doing Star Wars, which I was there during a lot of that. And sorry guys, I'll turn this off.
You're good.
And he had an extra panel that he drew,
right,
so that they could, drop that one out, put this one down here, and then make the whole thing fit different formats. And when the reprints were done of his Star Wars newspaper strip, there were always extra pages in the book for all those other little panels that were dropped. And they would be, like a trading card, Boba Fett,
right. Yeah.
There's a portrait. Or they might be something that is in the story, but isn't essential.
Right. Yeah. So that brings in, Mark, when you take over something like Prince Valiant, and of course you're a longtime fan, but did you go back and spend a lot of time really rereading the stuff in a different way? Because these characters, unlike Flash Gordon, these characters actually age. I mean, Prince Valiant is at least a middle-aged guy now, right?
Yeah, and actually, Gary Gianni and I kind of de-aged him a little bit. He much like Tarzan, he came across a formula that keeps him youthful, because at a certain point, the previous administration, the Murphys, had kind of ceded the strip to his kids, and Val was kind of the old diplomat, peacemaker, but he wasn't a warrior anymore so much. But Gary and I both agreed, and I think Tom agrees with this too, that the name of the strip is Prince Valiant. We wanted to see him first and foremost out there having adventures. And it's nice that he's got kids, but they're not what the strip is centrally about. So we kind of cheated a little bit to keep him kind of in a stasis age now. because the strip you had mentioned earlier, when did the strip begin? It began in 1937. And for the first half of its life, or close to the first half, he did kind of age at a close to real time rate, you know. But he would be dust in the grave by now if we kept with that. So
Right.
we fudge it a bit and use some some storytelling magic to lessen the impact of age upon good old Prince Valiant and his family.
The magic of ink on paper.
Yeah. And that is one of the differences, I think, that we have to contend with in a legacy strip that's been around as long as it has been, is that you have to start fudging things like that a little bit to maintain what the strip is about and what attracts people to the strip, and keep its flavor right. You just kind of have to start cheating a little bit.
I have a question from the chat, gentlemen. One of our mainstays, Eternity Forever, asks, how do you go about researching the time period? Is the world real, or is it a Hollywood version or type setting? Can you speak to that?
You want to take that, Mark?
Well, it's totally fantasy. You know, it's interesting. We see comments. Some people, because we have thrown in out and out fantasy elements, magic, sorcerers, interdimensional beings. We try not to go too far because Foster kind of had a limit beyond which he wouldn't go, and we've pushed it past that. But there are people that wish it stuck more with what they see as what Foster's did traditionally, and they think of that as like real medieval, but of course it isn't. If Val was an actual knight that happened in the 5th century, I mean, he'd be butchering peasants left and right at his whim. You know, it would be much more brutal. The women wouldn't have the currency that they do in the stories. It would be so out of tune with what we respect and what we look at in a hero and in characters that it wouldn't fly. And there'd be tons of dirt and all over the place. It just would be fun to write. So it's all a fantasy.
A lot fewer
It's all
teeth
a
to draw.
fantasy, yeah. And it's Foster's version of Arthurian legends, and we just push it in our own direction.
Did he actually write anything about that specifically that you read that gave you keys to that?
That's a good question, Tom. Do you know, Thomas, if there's
I'm pretty sure I have read maybe a snippet of an interview somewhere or something where he actually said that one of the reasons the 5th century, which is the oldest projected idea of when King Arthur actually lived, even if there even was a King Arthur, there, it's kind of hard to say, but he really Foster liked that period in part because it's the Dark Ages. It's not the Middle Ages. It's not the Renaissance. It's not classic Rome. It's the Dark Ages, which means nobody can bust him for doing something wrong, because it's dark means that the lights were turned off on the stage, for several hundred years, and there's not a lot of history known about that area in Europe during that era. There wasn't a lot of writings. There wasn't a lot of people who were educated. Rome had declined and kind of abandoned Europe, and they were the most civilizing element that had been in Western Europe. And then when they backed out, there was this gap for 500 years or whatever. That's the Dark Ages, and we don't really know much about it. So what gives us, Foster said, is it gives the writer free rein to do what he wants without being so obviously wrong. I mean, I learned a long time ago that it's Well, today that's not quite the truth, but when I originally got started, I would go to the library and research stuff, you know, tediously and try and draw the accurate, helmets or whatever of whatever the era adventure story I was drawing. And invariably people would get distracted because the helmets were kind of weird looking, or that kind of helmet is actually associated with somebody else in the public's mind. And so we're actually dealing with public consciousness that their sense of history is movies.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
that's what history looks like to them, is what they're used to in movies. But if they get interested in it, then they'll research it and they'll find out that that was inaccurate. So, and with Google and everything today, people are much more, it's much easier to find out what does science and archaeology think people back then were doing, or what, like we just did this whole thing in Londinium, which I always kind of wondered about Camelot, because Camelot isn't London. I don't remember ever hearing that. So, well, where's London? What's going on with London and Camelot? Wouldn't it have been in London? Isn't London the capital of England back then? And so we did this story where they come across Londinium, and it's this ruined city, fortified city, a walled city, and that the Romans built, and it's pretty much abandoned. And so I drew the ruins of this, just kind of made it all up, because the current London is built on top of Londinium, and there's not much to go on. It's exactly what it looked like. But I found a, hypothetical drawing online, and kind of based mine on that. But people wrote in, people who were British wrote in. See, when Mark and I say wrote in, the strip, in addition to going into all these newspapers, is also available online every Sunday at
right
King Features site, which is comicskingdom.com. So anybody who wants to see it regularly, just go to Comics Kingdom, scroll down to where you see the alphabetical listing of strips, because they got hundreds probably, and go down the P for Prince Valiant. It's right next to Popeye, and click on that, and you can see that every Sunday you can see our latest episode. And below where you see it, there's comments. So we are blessed with having comments, which are a mixed bag, but amusing. Usually amusing, and you get people who really claim to know their stuff, saying, "Oh, this wasn't there yet, and that wasn't here yet." And somebody kept writing in about stirrups. They didn't have stirrups on saddles. Horses, didn't have stirrups. That was the Chinese, or the Huns, or the Genghis Khan. Those guys brought having stirrups on your saddle when you ride a horse. Came from them, because then they could stand up in their saddles and swing their swords, and it gave you a lot more maneuverability, and it made their cavalry much more effective, and all blah blah. But Prince Valiant, it's been there by this time. By the time I got it, he'd been to Niagara Falls. He'd been to Central America. He'd been to China. So he would note, wow, this putting stirrups on really helps their knights when jousting or whatever. So he would go back to the old way. He'd tell his saddle maker, put stirrups on my saddle. So I can justify. You can justify a lot if you.
Yeah. It's funny that because
you want to.
Yeah, there's different types of fans for the different strips. On the Phantom, there's probably a lot of people that have things in common with Prince Valiant, because there are people, been reading the comics since the beginning, like my dad. The Phantom faces the same issue. It's the 21st Phantom. If he was 20 years old in 1936, he's dead, right? He's not this buff 45-year-old guy running around in the jungle sweating in that purple leotard, right? He has a cell phone. There's a lot of things that, Lee Falk's never had to consider any of this stuff when he retired and or he passed away, that you have to there's just sort of like give me's, either you're writing a completely unrealistic, made up world. I mean, look, the Phantom fought Nazis helped rescue astronauts and, fights modern terrorists, right? I mean, it's the same guy in the same skull cave. The little Goran, the little guy with the plain hat's been running around since like 1936. Obviously, he's a chubby little guy. He doesn't have any heart disease. It must be the Bandar magic. But some of the people will write in and be very specific, like you said, about things. Two instances really stand out to me. One was I drew the Phantom riding on the horse and being very dramatic. And some lady who was an equestrian wrote in and goes, he would never put his hands in that position. And I'm like, yeah, but it looks good. Right? I've never ridden a horse. I'm not a horse person. I do my research, try to make sure the saddle is accurate. It doesn't have the cowboy horn and all that kind of stuff. And then there was a Mauser I drew that's in this current storyline where the guys they're in Tibet. And so I actually researched an old Tibetan 1933 like Mauser. And some of the people were arguing whether that could be the correct Mauser, whether the metal would explode when the guy fired it, and they're like looking. I mean, the gun's like that big, right? I mean, it's just, but you have people and some of them live to find, this week Tom Yates fell down on the job. This week Mark Schultz made a mistake. It was,
That's what they're interested. Yeah. My favorite commentators call out on us was we had one of our characters behead another character, a bad guy. So she was justified, and it was a female, and it was done tastefully. It was off panel, but between the text and Thomas's very judicious art, it communicated what we wanted it to communicate, and again, we like to push and see what we can get away with sometimes. And I wasn't sure that King would let us show a beheading, but they did.
Really?
And much to their credit, the one commentator wrote and said, and seemed to really know what they were talking about, that was ridiculous. You could not behead a person with one swipe of your sword. It just doesn't work that way. They would have had to hack away at that to get the head off. And the person really seemed to know what they were talking about. So
listen, I've had my head cut off, sir. And you did it all wrong.
Or scarier, I've cut off enough people's heads to know what I'm talking about. Yeah,
I think it shows that the world is the world's full of frustrated editors. That's what we're hearing.
I guess. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that was interesting. And we get those folks. Yes, they're out there and they like to jump in, and they'll get pretty, they can get pretty cruel sometimes. But then, like a couple of weeks later, they're all effusive again. Well, this is the greatest.
Yeah.
I was curious. We were talking about the Phantom, who I've read some of the Phantoms, a smattering of them here and there, in the Comics Review, and so he hasn't passed the baton to the next generation since the strip started. Because it's built into the strip. I mean, it's built into it that it's a generational thing. But you do a flashback to a guy who's got a flintlock pistol, maybe.
Yeah. Well, we're actually dealing with that in the story right now, with what would be the 22nd Phantom, whether he will actually come to the 22nd Phantom. And part of the thing is, when you deal with this is something I got introduced to, I guess, doing strips, which was very different than comics. Because comics is sort of like anything goes, but strips is very conservative. They're very worried about what you do. Do you do, like when I started on Judge Parker, they didn't want me to sign my name. And I had to imitate Ed Barretto, who was the guy who was doing it before me, because they were afraid that if they said Mike Manley, that people would like, what? Oh, I'm canceling my, I'm canceling my subscription.
Yeah.
And it actually took a while for the byline to change. And I know the writer, Tony, and I have talked about, realistically, you would have, if this was in comic books, they would have had a couple more phantoms. But there's that thing about genre fiction where it's always the spider, it's always Spider-Man, it's always the Shadow, it's always Batman, even though there's Batman Beyond and there's these other sort of alternative things. And now they have Clark Kent's son or whatever. It's still basically those major characters. And if you're making a complete make-believe world like Gotham City, you can kind of cheat. But if then you make Gotham City look like New York City, or you look like Chicago, and there's this realism to it, like when Jack Kirby drew New York, it was a Jack Kirby stylization of all that detail that you see when you go to New York, right? So it was like the Marvel Comics New York. And I remember the first time I went to New York as a kid thinking like, well, it doesn't really look like a Jack Kirby drawing, but I can see what he was doing because it's just all that stuff, right? So it's like an other world. Same way with Ditko. All those great stylists had that way of doing something and making it like Dick Tracy, make it put into it what they needed for it to be convincing. In our strip, and in your strip more than my strip, it really has to be convincing because the guy who did it was all about realism. You know what I mean? Was all about light and shadow and texture and drapery. And, there was only so far he would make the expression on somebody's face go, only so far he would go with the body language. And if you go too far from that, then it becomes something else. And then a lot of the longtime readers and even the syndicate they want to push back against that because they have a client. The client expects the strip to look a certain way. So you're sort of hemmed in a way, because if you really change it, somebody might say, well, that's it. It's not Kit Walker anymore. It's, Kit Walker Jr. the 17th, that's the Phantom, and we don't like it.
Sure. Well, we've all seen all those relaunches that were a disaster, particularly in movie form. There's a way for me to put, because I did this with Tarzan, there's a way to put the original character into a new situation where he's still the original character, even though he's in a totally different type of adventure than he's ever had before. It's still that character, and hopefully the readership will pick up on whatever it is that has made that character popular for decades. And it's still there. And I think we try to do that with Prince Valiant. We try to keep that spirit because Mark and I, we love that old stuff. That's the way our own work has a pretty darn similar ethos to it, to Hal Foster's ethos anyway, So it's sort of like that's just the waters that we swim in, is that kind of stuff that works okay for us doing it. I wonder if I ever got to the place where I could retire, who is out there younger than us who draws that way, who has that aesthetic. Not that it's a better aesthetic than anybody else's, but that's the Prince Valiant thing,
Right.
Williamson and Angelo Torres and Wallace Wood and Gray Morrow and all recrammed all these great artists, Alex Raymond, they had this certain kind of it was a romanticized, very similar to the great adventure movies of the 30s and stuff, Gunga Din and Robin Hood and the Mark of Zorro and all that stuff. It just had, there was some kind of a spirit of adventure there that, as Mark was saying, is undoubtedly completely inaccurate to what life would have been like in, the Dark Ages in Britain. But
Right.
it's a great show. It's just a
Right.
great show. And so
in the Dark Ages, you break your toe, you get infected, you're 18 and you die. It's
yeah. So, but who have you guys encountered young artists who are into that kind of straightforward, naturalistic, not so much pizzazz in the line work, but in the inking style, like the, Image Comics, had some great art. They had this different look to it, though. The inking style was really dazzling, and I'm always amazed with the really good guys from there, But it isn't anything close to what Foster did, and the more current illustrators, for the most part, seem to be more influenced by manga, which is very different. Also, it's great. I saw an incredible art show at a museum of Miyazaki's stuff that really blew me away. Paintings from his career. But anyway, I'm just saying that all that stuff's great. But who's out there who draws anything like Foster, or is even attempting, the Raymond School or any of that?
Well, being a teacher for the past 20 years, I come along talented students. I think the real difference is that at our age, when we came along in the 60s and the 70s, we caught the end of that era because all the guys were sort of in their prime, from Neil Adams to Kubert to Kirby to Al, Woody. I mean, that whole EC, all the great Heath, all the great people.
Frank Frazetta was on the newsstands on the book covers,
right?
And he was coming from, he's total Foster head,
Oh yeah. But you don't see. First of all, it would be hard to find. I know this from a couple of younger friends of mine. They're just amazed by how hard you have to work to do a newspaper strip, number one. I mean, it's like the endless treadmill, right? A comic, you get a fill-in, or you could get an inker, or it's a lot easier to draw Spider-Man than it is Judge Parker. Having a table where you have to have 7 or 5 people sitting and eating and doing real naturalistic things is way more difficult than the Hulk smashing some guy through the wall. I mean, that's not realism. So you're completely free to do whatever you want. But there maybe are some European guys, like the guy who does Undertaker. He's very good. But no, you're not really getting people coming along that do naturalism. And a lot of the talent now goes into animation, games, concept design, right? Everyone wants to be a character designer. Everybody wants to be a concept designer or work in animation.
Sure.
Nobody says, I want to be a comic book artist. And to them, like Joe Kubert was like mother's milk to us, or just like John Buscema or Gil Kane was always there. You never even thought about it. Every time you went and got a comic, it was one of those artists. Now when they go, they're not even interested. All the girls that I teach, all the young female artists, they are not interested in Iron Man. They're interested in Miyazaki. They're interested in the anime and the manga stuff that they see. It's much more inclusive. It's very creative.
Autobiographical stuff.
Yeah.
Wins awards. The gal from Iran wrote one some years ago that won all these awards. The autobiographical.
Persepolis.
Persepolis.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that stuff is rocking. I think it's great. But
Yeah.
who am I going to get to take Prince Valiant? I want to retire.
Thomas, how do you-
It would be hard. It would be. Well, get Mark. See.
Well, Thomas, how do you work? Is it digital? Is it traditional?
No, it's tradition.
You
Yeah.
working like the size of a mural, the way Foster did, or? Oh my goodness!
Wow.
Yeah, there you go.
Now is that what is that on Strathmore 500, 400?
400, Strathmore 400. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic.
So you have to scan it in pieces?
That's Morgan Maffei on a cliff, a historically or geographically accurate, hopefully, eastern shore of Great Britain, just coming south of Scotland. And she's doing a little offering, burning some herbs in a fire on the cliff because her retinue of strange looking characters who are her attendants went down in a shipwreck, and Prince Valiant rescued her. So then we got to have fun with Prince Valiant rescuing the villainess, which we got. Well, you want me to show it since you put it on bigger?
Yeah, give us one more.
Yeah.
Here, I'll give you another one. So Prince Valiant has to take care of Morgan Le Fay, and her staff have all drowned, and so they go riding through the countryside, and here they come to this village, and she's going, "Uh-oh, I think we got to get out of here." And we see that there's a stake here where someone's been burned at the stake, and there's these, black robed priests standing around. And then they leave that little village, and Morgan says, "A witch was burned here." And then she makes some comment about that's Arthur's legacy. And Prince Valiant's going, "Well, I don't like witch burnings," and he's pissed off. And it kind of makes Morgan Le Fay, who's been the kind of a villain, more sympathetic. And anyway, here's another one. And so they end up in Londinium, and they have to fight their way out of Londinium. And this was one where I finally realized I needed to do the Jack Kirby thing, and rather than draw 1,000 Saxons fighting Prince Valiant, I just did a real tight close-ups.
Yeah.
And it's so much faster, and it's fun to have the big shapes for change,
Oh yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
Tom. Tom, our buddy Tim asks, "What inks are you using for your spot blacks, or just you have one formula for everything?"
Bombay Black.
Okay.
Bombay, that's good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's made by Dr. Martin Dyes, and that was one of my art heroes. Alex Nino told me about Bombay Black. So, because everybody was always complaining about the inks aren't what they used to be.
Yeah.
Now, I have been doing the finished inking. I had been forever, since the old days, with a watercolor brush, and which is a classic tool, from Foster to Raymond and everybody at DC and Marvel, practically, except John Severin, who inked with a pen. They all would use a brush. It's a watercolor brush, kind of expensive, and you dip it in a ball of that and you ink. But recently, and then when I go to conventions, some years back, 20 years ago or whatever, the Japanese brushes came in. And that's what I would take to a convention. The ink wasn't waterproof, so if you got rained on or something, it would blur. But for going to a convention, you don't really want to carry around a bottle of ink, and because you have to wash the brush immediately after using it, because if the ink dries, it ruins the brush. So you always have to deal with washing the brush out. And I'm getting old, and I'm getting lazy, and I find myself just not washing the brush, and then the ink's hardened on it, and then it's, it doesn't work. It doesn't go to a point as good. So I discovered that this Pentel brush pen that I had been using at conventions has you see the point there?
Yeah.
A pretty big brush. that they were now, I went in to buy some refills for it, and the only refills they had were gray. They weren't black. And I found out that the ones in the gray refill are waterproof. It's waterproof ink. So eventually I just gave up. And I don't know, about the first of this year, I started doing all my inking with the Micron, or not the Micron, the Pentel Japanese brush pen.
Yeah.
The first couple of ones I showed you were probably still done with the brush, but the last few were done with that thing. And I'll use a brush once in a while. The brush has got a better, it's got a better quality to the way you use it. I prefer the brush, but the trade-off of not having to take care of it, care and feeding of my brush so that it'll perform for me, is worth the trade-off. And I just am learning how to ink with the Japanese brush pen, the Pentel one. And it's big and it holds a lot of ink, and it'll lay down a really thick line, because I love putting black on the page.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Well,
Did you color the work, or is there someone else do that?
No, Tom Roberts was the colorist before I got the job. I got to do the drawings, but Mark was already writing, and Thomas Scott Roberts was already doing the lettering and coloring. So when I came in to fill Gary's spot, Gary Gianni, that was all I was doing. The rest of it was, they already had people doing those, Mark and Scott. And so Scott letters it. I letter it very carefully on the originals. I figure out exactly how much space it's going to take up, and I pencil it in so that I'm a control freak. I've seen what letterers will do if they're unsupervised, and it ain't pretty. So I put all that in there. So I don't draw, because some of the captions are kind of big, because the lettering is huge. It's front way down, so the lettering is huge on the page. So there's always a chunk of a quarter of the panel. Sometimes it's not. He's not as bad as Feldstein though. And it has to be the text, and so I just design the page with the knowledge that this much space goes to the text, And
did Foster letter that himself, or did he have somebody letter it for him?
Well, I haven't really ever learned very much about his staff, but I'm sure that he had people working for him, because Tex Blaisdell, an old warhorse comic book artist who ended up teaching at school, at Joe Kubert School in New Jersey. I didn't have Tex as a teacher, although we were there at the same time, and I spoke with him once in a while. He taught the year behind me. And one of my old friends that I stayed friends with was pretty close with Tex, and Tex would stay at his house sometimes rather than drive back home to upstate New York or wherever Tex lived from New Jersey, where the Kubert School was. And he said that Tex inked a lot of Hal Foster's stuff, and because Tex had the ability to ape other artists' inking style. And Hal Foster's inking style is very simple. It's not snazzy Rudy Nebres or something that is just, you look at the technique and you go, wow. It's his concept and his thoughts and his drawing, and it's inked very simply. But so anyway, Tex supposedly did a lot of inking, and he told and another guy who was friends with Tex is Hy Eisman, who taught at the school, and it drew Little Iodine, and then the Cats and Jammer Kids and Popeye, I think, lots of legacy strips. I think he just retired from that. He's 90-something now. I stayed in touch with him a little bit over the years. And he said that Tex told him that Foster drew people and animals the way you and I write words. Which is kind of, yeah. He just could just flow right out of that pencil, There it is.
Well, I think, he's probably of that generation. I think one of the things we don't really think about it, but going back that far, I mean, he was born in the 1800s, and he grew up on a farm, and he saw animals like every day. He saw animals. He if you go back to people who artists who grew up in the 1800s and then lived into the mid 40s or 50s, those people often grew up on farms. They were around animals all the time.
Yeah.
And you tell that when you look at their work, because they understand the back leg of a horse in a way that, way a horse will stand. When you look at MC Wyeth's work, you always see that he really understood horses.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He wasn't looking at a John Wayne comic and copying a horse. He understood a horse and
wasn't looking at an action figure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, whenever I have to draw a horse, it's always a bit of work because I don't live on a farm. I don't have a horse. I don't ride a horse. I've seen horses, but when I look at somebody like Frank Godwin, really, that guy with 4 lines, you knew that they understood the anatomy.
Yeah.
Of the horse,
But Mike, you gotta say,
Salinas was no slouch at that either.
Oh my
yeah,
God.
Salinas, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
You guys remember that stack of Salinas originals that Al had?
That's right.
That
Incredible
stuff was fantastic.
Yeah.
but Thomas, you grew up with horses too, and it shows in your horses.
Did you?
I mean, they really are alive. And the
true.
proportions are perfect.
It's true. You can see there's a Frederick Remington print on the wall.
Oh yeah.
So my dad grew up on a farm in eastern Colorado. He was at a homestead at one point, and his family didn't have any money, but they had a great time. They grew their own food and trapped, and he had just his older brothers described this real idyllic childhood. So he had a horse, and when he was like 10 years old, and that was his transportation, go out in the fields and do stuff or whatever. He came to Sacramento where he met my mother and where I grew up because college was free. And so I came out here so he could go to college, and then World War II happens. He went off to the war, and then they got married and had the family, and he ended up in real estate. But he always had that kind of cowboy underneath this, you dig very deep under the skin, and there's a cowboy there under the business suit. So I have 3 older sisters, and they all went horse crazy, as girls often do when they get to be, 10 or whatever. And I was the youngest, and they all wanted a horse so bad. My dad got a horse. He bought this old plug that was, just stand there, and the kids could climb all over him. He's a great big giant horse, and didn't have a mean bone in his body. And my dad was buying and selling property in the outskirts of Sacramento, where you could buy big chunks of land and they'd sell it to a strip mall developer or something. But he could put the horse on the property. So as a little boy, I would go out with him and build fences around these vacant lots that he bought, and we'd put the horse there. And then, a year or 2 later, he'd sell it, subdivide it or whatever, and he'd put the horse in another place. There was 2 or 3, and then he ended up stabling the horses right down the street from our house. There was as you go outside of town, the zoning changes from agricultural to residential in this kind of patches. And so there'll be a residential area, then there'll be an area that's zoned rural still, and you can have horses or a little farm or chickens or whatever. And so anyway, there was a place close by, and we ended up putting horses there. And over the course of my life, starting when I was 5 years old in 1960, my dad there was always 1 to 3 horses that we had. And I would go over and feed them on my way to school in the morning. And they were kind of a hassle, my dad but it was great at the same time. I mean, as a kid, when you have to do the farm chores that I had to do, it's a little bit of an imposition, but it was all right. In hindsight, I was very fortunate, and I rode the horses regularly with my dad, and I would go on horseback rides in the mountains up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, or down at the river, right in Sacramento. And I didn't like get the bug to where I wanted to have a horse when I grew up, but they're pretty amazing animals. And when you get to know an animal that's that big really well, it's impressive. They're incredibly strong, and they could stomp you into the dust if they wanted to, but they don't, because they have these really goofy personalities. They're very curious, and they're herd animal. So they like to be around other horses. They'll fight with them. We had to keep the two horses in separate pens because they bite and kick each other, and then you got vet bills. But so you put divide the corral in two, so they're in two different. They don't hurt each other.
That sounds like Manley and me. Yeah.
But they always have to have each other around, or they really go crazy. But anyway, I have a sense of horses that has served me okay in the modern world, but in Foster's era, or the Frederick Remington era, or the Frank Godwin era, I would have been a pretty lame horse artist. But today, I'm okay. I can get by.
Oh, just to let you know, Brett had to leave. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. I would have liked to talk to Brett more.
He had to catch a plane, but he
Mark, why don't you talk a little bit about your inking too? Because I mean, you do. You're one of the most incredible inkers in comics, with all that amazing dry brush technique, split hair brush and stuff that you do. And I think one of the things that I find the most fascinating about your pairing is that you're both such great artists, and you don't really have, I can't think of another example where you had like a great artist who wrote for another great artist. It's like great artist, and then, you know, maybe you have a good writer, maybe you have a crappy writer, but you usually don't get two such strong artists working on the same thing when it's not like pencil or inker or something like that.
Well, thank you. But I think the most important element I bring is that, as someone who has done comics myself, I have a pretty good understanding of what's going to work panel to panel, and what is necessary in the panel, what is not necessary in the panel. And I mean, I don't think, and Thomas can comment on this, I like to think I'm not over controlling, but I can give Thomas enough information that he knows what has to be in there to keep the story moving, because what has to be in a certain panel may not pay off till the week after that, and Thomas may not have that strip yet, or that script yet. So I've got to give him enough information, but I don't want to step on him and try to over control the situation. I don't, he's the artist, it's his head. He's got to work in a manner and with his imagination to keep him engaged with the strip. So, I like to think that, being someone who understands drawing myself and graphic storytelling, that, that's something that is positive about my understanding, is that I can give Thomas a good springboard from which to take, take what I give him and develop into something that's his own.
It's great working with Mark. It's great. We're just on the same page, as far as the kind of stuff we want to do, the kind of stuff we like. If I have some ideas that are different, he usually goes, "Oh, that's he likes it, hearing my ideas," and he actually uses them sometimes, which is, I had not really always experienced that. In my career, I'm drawing a writer's fantasy, not mine, so to speak. But with Mark, we're really copacetic, and it's really great to get to work with him. And I'll ask him, I can't see this scene you've described. I can't quite come up with a way how to stage it. And he can just do a little quick sketch and say, once in a while that'll happen. And he can see it in his head. So if I can't see it, I just ask him, and he'll tell me, well, it's like this,
Yeah.
Can you make it a little tighter? Can you make it a little tighter? Can you link it a little? I'll link it. Thanks.
We've got a question from Ronaldo on YouTube. He's got This is, I think, mostly for Mark. How much do you draw on real life situations or even situations that happen to you to lift for your plots? Is that
pretty
nothing at all?
frequently?
Sword fights?
Pretty frequently. I mean, again, this goes back to what I wanted to say about how Thomas and I will develop a story arc. You know, maybe one of us will have just a rough idea. Just hey, like Thomas said to me the other day, hey, let's get Val to Northern Europe. We haven't had him there. And it's like, oh yeah, okay. Well, what's the reason? I start thinking, then why would he want to go there? Well, he still has family in Thule. You know, maybe that's part of it. And I'll throw that out to Thomas, and he'll say something else to add to that. You know, and just bouncing that idea back and forth is so much fun, and rounding it into a story eventually. And so we get the big picture, and then as the questionnaire asked, you know, do real life situations or conversations entered? Absolutely. You know, I start thinking about, it could be something that I read in the paper. It could be like he suggested, a conversation I had, but that enters in and starts fleshing out the story, starts bringing some characterization to the elements in the story, the characters in the story, starts making them more, you know, individuals, real people. So yeah, all those factors go into gluing something together and making it work on both like the epic scale, on the grand adventure scale, and on a personal scale. You know, because Bedrock, people keep coming back to any given property, any given story, because of the characters, because they like the characters, because there's something there that they identify with. So I say, you know, when I'm teaching and I get students that come up with these great world building concepts that are just enormous, and I try to remind them, that's great, that's really original, it's great, but it's not going to keep people coming back if they don't love the characters, if they don't fall in love with your characters. And I think that was the great thing about what Foster did with Prince Valiant, and you could tell that he was taking from his relationships with people. His relationship with his wife had a huge part of the relationship between Val and Val's wife Alita. So yeah, it all goes into, you know, making the recipe that makes the whole thing come together. Yeah.
That's
yeah,
wonderful.
I think that, you know, that's when you think about it, to come back and to have a character. There's very few characters in comics that you're sort of carrying on the singular voice of an author. So you're carrying Foster's voice while at the same time scratching your own itch, trying to express your own voice in sympathy, you know, with his voice. And I was thinking that, you know, you could take another character that everybody knows, like Batman, and then you have hundreds of people literally contributing to making, like, if I say Batman, people think of Batman as a person, like as an actual physical character, when really he's this combination of zillions of people combining these ideas that sometimes work together and sometimes don't work together and sometimes clash with each other. It's kind of like a magic trick when you think about it. Like if I say Bugs Bunny, you think of Bugs Bunny just like you think of any one of us here, but actually Bugs Bunny is just Mel Blanc's voice and a bunch of drawings.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's like alchemy, you know?
Wait, what?
I've been meaning to have this conversation with you, Jamar. I'm
Bugs
sorry.
isn't real.
I didn't want to
There's no
find
real
out.
Bugs Bunny.
I'll be right back. I gotta go.
Don't bring up Santa Claus. Jeez.
Yeah.
Wait,
So-
what happened to Santa Claus?
So I'm thinking like
Nothing-
you guys
nothing.
are carrying on.
Nothing to see here.
Yeah, exactly. You're carrying on this voice, this persona, this character, and you're right. I mean, there are people that have been reading that strip for what 50 years or more easily now, right? And to them, they still relate to him as the same character and the same with the same interest and the same fondness. Because you guys know if you do something wrong or you start going down a wrong road, people let you know, like, this is not my Prince Valiant. I don't know what's going on here. Some of it is that you're not 12 anymore, and 12 being the magical age when you usually discover these things. But does
Right.
that ever percolate in your brain? Do you ever think about that?
Well, about people are looking at it differently now than when they were young, or that
Or that you're aware that you're still singing that you're singing his song. You know what I mean? But you're trying to sing in your voice too.
oh yeah. We look at that stuff, and Foster's work was just so damn well written. In addition to be the phenomenal artwork, it's so well written that it's really a joy to go back and reread the old stuff. And some of it I haven't read. I haven't actually gone through the whole epic yet. There's still some years, late 50s and 60s, that I haven't read. But it's just great material to be inspired by, So we don't know why fight it. We like it, and it works. And it for some unknown reason, it's still got a whole bunch of papers. I don't know how in this modern world that something that anachronistic, this guy in his goofy haircut who doesn't have any tech, he doesn't, it's just so old fashioned, but there's something in there. I always just figure it's because Foster did set the bar so high that those of us who have followed have really busting our asses to try and get it that good. But
right, we have so much respect and love for that. We just try to maybe build on it, but certainly in no way see any reason why it should be altered or undermined. I mean, you want to build on this incredible legacy that Foster developed. And I don't mean legacy in vague terms. I guess what I mean is, again, as Thomas said, it's an outdated genre adventure setting that's, you don't see movies being made of Arthurian material very often, occasionally, but it's certainly nothing that has a huge hold on young people today. But the characters are so great. Foster made very relatable characters. Jay Kennedy, my first editor on the strip, when I started, I was all excited, and my initial submissions were for these big epic adventures. And he says, well, this is great, do that, but don't forget that people also want to see Val as a family man. They want to see the character stuff between he and his family. Don't abandon that. That's important too. And that was great advice, because it's the nice balance between the epic adventure stuff and him as a warrior and a leader, but also you do the anodyne. Then he gets home, and his kids don't have a great deal of respect for him, maybe, and his wife wants him to take out the trash, but he wants to go out drinking with the guys. So it's a nice foil situation. They play against each other nicely, and that's Foster. Foster brought that to the table.
absolutely, yeah, that's Foster. Yeah.
I guess you had that on Prince. I mean, you never had that on Flash Gordon. It was just purely adventure, which would kind of get technically updated every decade. The spacesuit would change and look a little bit more like this and a little bit more like this. But you don't really know outside of that. Well, Dale's my girlfriend, and Dr. Zarkov's the crazy scientist guy, and Ming is evil. The characters were never really developed to where they had another side to them, which maybe that's why it's harder to age. I mean, that's one of the things the Phantom has, is he has a family. They got married, they have the twins. There's a lot of that. His children are growing up. Of course, they'd all be like middle-aged by now, actually aged in real time. But that might be one of the reasons why he lasted and Flash Gordon didn't. Because I was actually talking to King a couple of years back because they were trying to figure out, like, well, maybe they want to redo Flash Gordon. But sort of the problem I think they were facing was two problems. Was guys running around in capes, fighting guys with wings on their backs, doesn't really fly for teenage males today. That's not going to appeal like it appealed to somebody in like 1939.
I love that stuff.
Right? But if you change it and it doesn't touch on that, then the people who are the lifelong fan goes, well, I'm not into the new adventures of Johnny Quest. That's bullshit. I'm not going to watch that, right? They're not going to watch the new. And so they have the cheesy movie, and they were trying to figure out, like, well, how do we take something from the cheesy Flash Gordon movie and then the old Flash Gordon, but then like update it to make it like a new Flash Gordon? And it's like, it's really hard to kind of marry some things because they're just so far back in time that if you update them, it just
Yeah.
That touches on a question that JRD has on YouTube. He said, have either of you watched any of the various films or TV adaptations? And or would the family, would the syndicate prefer you not watch those?
I don't have anything against them. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I saw the Prince Valiant movie with Robert Wagner and Janet Leigh, and it's fun. It's not quite Foster, but it's fun. It's well done. But as far as I never saw any of the animated Prince Valiant or King characters pieces at all. And as far as King wanting us to see them or not, I'd say in general, King has been really hands off with us. And Mike, I don't know what your situation has been, but
yeah, I mean, basically,
do what we want to do, and
you only hear from them if you're late. If you're late, then they're like, "Where's this week's strips?" No, they're basically hands off. I know Tony runs story ideas past them, and I no longer have any input on the Judge Parker stuff. I never had a lot, but I really don't have any input on or contribution to the story. I just draw what they send me. Tony and I talk, and we go and also partially because he knows way more about the Phantom than I do. I mean, that's the other thing about coming onto a legacy strip. Even if you were a fan of it, like you were saying, you can't know all the stuff. You've got to go back and look at the Sunday from July 7th, 1958 and go, oh, that's that guy. There's a lot of that. And Tony's great with that. Also, the people who are fans of the Phantom, especially the guys from Australia, if I have a question, they have PDFs of like the entire run. They know the stuff way better than I will ever know it. And so I'm sure with Prince Valiant, there's somebody you could say, what was that pirate in this year or whatever? And they will go send you a JPEG of it.
Yeah.
One of the things that surprised me was that the syndicates don't really know their own material because the editors from that era are all dust. And they don't even always have good copies.
Yeah.
they when I came on board, I was familiar with the Foster's work on Prince Valiant, but not so much the how many years? 30 years that the Murphys were doing the strip.
Right.
And they were only able to send me photocopies of maybe I think about half of the maybe 15 years worth of material. They did not have archives of the rest. Now they've also, I know, in recent years been trying to put their archives in order. So they may very well have found, what do they call them? I'm on the blank. What do you call the
proofs? The syndicate proofs?
Archives?
Yeah,
No,
proofs. Yeah, proofs. Yeah,
Proofs.
maybe they found proofs of the rest.
Well, I know Al had those fantastic. He had that one section in the studio that was just basically syndicate proofs. He had a whole run of Johnny Hazard. I mean, a lot of the early reprints came from guys getting copies of his stuff to do, like the Dragon Lady Press guy and all that. And all that stuff. But yeah, I sort of found that sort of surprising, because you would figure, well, that's like their, I don't know, that would be like Warner Brothers going like, well, we don't have any copies of Casablanca anymore. I got a 5-minute loop, or I just have the end,
Back in the days, like comic book art, I mean, that was all, once and done, disposable. No one saw a second a second usage for any of this material. It was just in the way. It was taking up space and costing money. So get rid of it.
Yeah.
King Features gave Foster originals away to a teenage fan whose mom took him up there for a visit.
Yeah.
That was Al.
I was reading. I forget.
That's how Williamson got those. He got them for free. His mom took him up there, and they said, "Hey, you want some art, kid? I think there's some in the corner over there,
Yeah, well, evidently, I mean, the story Al told me was that he knew the guard, and he could basically describe the guard and just go in and go like, just take a garbage bag and just put the stuff inside, because they didn't care. You're right.
They didn't care.
Yeah, I often see on Heritage, you'll see panels that Foster himself cut and signed and sent to people if they wrote them.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like one of those.
Hey, I have a question from the room. A good buddy, Ben Harvey, who's a magnificent comic book artist in his own right, says, myself, meaning him, not me, coming from a generation of artists where information is accessible 24/7, can the group briefly talk about how difficult it was to find specific references for your projects before the internet or the morgue, gentlemen? How did you find your clippings? Can you talk to that?
Well, how about you, Mark? You must, I'm sure, like me, we all had swipe files. We all had files of clippings, cut pictures out of magazines, go to the library. I would always just go to the library and maybe check out a book on whatever that era was that I was drawing. I'm drawing some battle in the South Pacific theater of World War II. I'd find a book so I can get the Japanese uniforms right and the kind of rifles they used right, and the bayonets or whatever, right? Or just copy a Sam Glanzman comic.
That's a big part of it. But in addition to what Thomas says, I still have a subscription to National Geographic, and which has all sorts of use, and good old Walden's books used to have those remainder tables filled with books for the $3.95, which were great references. Until the internet came along, that was my book for reptiles and my book for cats and my book for, cars 1940 to 1970. It's just, and actually I'm trying to move them now and get rid of them. I really don't need them. And I've got too much stuff. I mean, common problem. I know I'm talking to the choir here, but too many books that are sitting around that are not used, haven't been used for decades now, but they were valuable at the time.
Yeah, I remember the one reference, the biggest reference issue I probably ever had was I was drawing an issue of Quasar where he fights MODOK, or Modam, who was the female version of MODOK, and he's inside the head of the Statue of Liberty. So you can find a million pictures of the outside of the outside of the Statue of Liberty, but what does the head of the inside of the Statue of Liberty look like? And so I remember going to the library, and I think I found one like blueprint drawing that had like a schematical thing from the side where it showed where the stairway went up, and there was, I guess, like a railing, and then you could see, well, there's the window. So at least I knew, okay, there's a stairway, and then there's the window. And then I basically just had to like cheat and make it up. Of course, now you go on Google, and there's like everybody posing, and you can see every angle from the inside of the Statue of Liberty. You can probably find a 3D model of the inside of the Statue of Liberty's head. But yeah, there was a lot of things like I would get old encyclopedias of Egypt or whatever.
Yeah.
So you could like copy a picture of the pyramid or
Right.
Suppose
I have a couple of
Go
I
ahead.
have a couple of sets of old encyclopedias where there's some of them, if they have if it's a Time Life series or something like that from like the 40s or up through the 1960s, they have great photography, great layout where it isn't just a bunch of little tiny fuzzy black and white photos. That's actually, really well laid out book. And you don't see that stuff on the internet. So it's different swipe. I was on a Zoom with Joe Jusko, who was talking about using reference off the internet. Everybody sees the same elephant. You Google elephant stampede or elephant running, and you see it, and that's great. And everybody's drawing the same one. But sometimes those old books, you've got stuff that people maybe it was copied by, an illustrator in the 20s or 30s, but hopefully people today haven't seen that one.
The secret to Googling is learning how to ask a question more than one way. The more you can ask, you don't write elephant stampede, you run, elephant riot, elephant running.
Yeah.
3 elephants, fighting elephants.
Yeah.
And it's funny because relating to that, when I first started teaching, I assumed, okay, all these young people, they've got the internet and they're going to be all way more advanced than me, right? And so I had one assignment, which was to draw 3 different types of kitchens. A pirate ship kitchen, or a kind of kitchen that like Jerry would make from like Tom and Jerry, like a little animal would like put stuff together and make a kitchen. And then another kitchen that a robot would have. And what I found out right away was they couldn't do the pirate one because you don't call a kitchen on a ship a kitchen, you call it a galley.
They didn't know what
right away.
the
They were like, I looked for a kitchen on a pirate ship and I couldn't. So they were stumped, and out of that lesson came the idea that you have to, the secret to technology like Google or any of these search engines is learning how to ask the question, and you might have to ask it in 3 or 4 different ways, because you're right. You don't want the one picture that everybody's got from Discovery magazine of the elephant running at you, because
everybody's got it. Yeah.
Hey, yeah. So I did throw out a bunch of books. I just recycled them. Was it last year? Because I had all these old ship books, like that had like all kinds of different landing craft and stuff that would get at library sales, because you're always having to draw an old freighter. And in fact, I remember when I was in Al's studio, an issue of Powerline I drew that he inked. I had to draw an old freighter ship, and he had some old freighter ship swipe that I used from him. And then he showed me how to use the artograph and how to turn a picture into a drawing. Mm-hmm. It's not just tracing it. That was the thing that I learned from him, is how he could take a picture, a photo, And he could turn that photo into an Al Williamson drawing, which is not just tracing the photo. He would make the drawing into, he would use the photo like sort of like as his underdrawing. And he knew when to stylize a fold or exaggerate something or make something look good, because there's a lot of things, if you just trace a photo, like the hand might be weird or there's shapes you accept as a photograph, but as a drawing look really awful.
And that's the secret. You don't copy, you reference it and you make it your own. And right. And you can tell people that artists that just do a cold copy of a photograph or another drawing, you know, it's still, it doesn't move. You can tell the proportions are often kind of wonky because the camera's eye doesn't see what our eye sees. It sees differently. So yeah, you reference, you learn from what you're referencing, but you don't copy it.
Right. Yeah.
You make it your own.
We were talking about how Hal Foster's the most swiped cartoonist, and Thomas, you'd be like the only one allowed to swipe from him, right? Do you ever find yourself thinking, I want to homage to a original Hal Foster drawing in any of the episodes?
I've definitely swiped from Foster. I definitely have here and there. Not usually. I can just kind of draw out of my head. I just go for it, and then if I having trouble, I'll look for a reference, or I'll remember when I read the plot description from Mark, I'll go, oh, that sounds like this movie. I have a book on that or something, and I'll remember some reference I have and use it. But then sometimes it doesn't work on the page. Like you think it's going to be this perfect. Oh yeah, that's perfect. I'll use this shot there, and it just kind of doesn't work. And it's good to stick with your. You have to find a balance between the reference and making everything up out of your head, so that you don't get trapped in the photo tracing thing. Which I traced photos in high school. The first time I got serious about drawing. I drew all the time, but I didn't get really serious till I got to be a freshman in high school. And I was drawing all the time, in high school we had a good art department. They introduced me to pen and ink, bottle of ink and a pen you dip in it, still tip pen, just like all those guys used. And I was like, wow, I just love that black ink line. Then I had two art teachers, and the first one was academic oriented, Joe Sugimoto, and then Clyde Hike was junior and senior year, and he was into art is anything you can get away with. He was into the expressionist movement of the time and abstract stuff and weird performance art, all kinds of weird stuff. And to get his students to be able to bring something home to show mom and dad, he would say, bring in photos that have a lot of contrast that you like, a photo you like. And he'd put on the opaque projector and you'd project it and you'd outline the shapes of the contrasty photo, and you make one color pink and you make the other color blue or something. And he had a psychedelic album cover.
Right. Yeah.
That was sort of in style at the time. This was the late 60s. And so I just did what he was teaching everybody else to do and put, a picture on there and blow it up on the projector and trace it. So I was hip to that from early on, from high school. And I would go back and forth between whether I was tracing a photo or, in fact, my first public works were traced photos of rock musicians. Like Bob Dylan was the first one in a fanzine that got published. So I was, but even then I would try and do J. St. John line work, and I would try and do the Foster kind of shading, rendering on the faces, or the Frank Frazetta dynamic, compositions with sky and stuff. I'd still mess with it even before I really knew that I had to do that. I just would want to, because the photo by itself wasn't that interesting. You take it out of context, and it needs that environment. It needs a black shape up there and the whatever. So, but you got to get the right balance. You got to get the right balance between the two. I ended up not tracing hardly. Eventually, I just kind of swore off tracing, and I would only just copy the photo, which is a lot more work. And it would save me an enormous amount of time if I would trace. But for some reason, I just kind of decided not to do that. I don't know, one job I did a lot of trace economy I wasn't happy with. And I just decided not to do that anymore, you know. But working with Al and meeting him early on, and that was, he does come on up to the studio sport and you're hanging out with him and you see how he works. He traced photos. You know, they were usually photos. So it was still his art, you know, you can kind of rationalize it that way. But man, the results he got were just, you know, phenomenal.
Because he knew how he knew how to turn that photo into an Al Williamson drawing.
Yep.
If you made that same photo to somebody else, it wouldn't look like an Al Williamson drawing.
Right.
One of those things again.
Playing a message from me.
Yeah, I remember somebody asked me this the other day. It was Joe Rubenstein. What I learned when I was his assistant, and I said, "Well, I was never his assistant. I shared his studio, and Al was not the kind of guy who would, like my friend Ricardo Villagran is much more technical. He could say this, not this. He could say this muscle here, this bone here, and Al was not that kind of an artist. He was like a feeling guy. He like, you know, like tongue sticking out, trying to get that, yeah, that looks good, or fuck, and he'd throw his pen across the room, storm out, you know, he'd get really mad. So I learned by watching him. One of the things I learned, I was saying, is I learned, because I was using the same pen, the Hunt 108. But I was not getting the same kind of line. And then I noticed that the way he held the pen was further back. And I was holding the pen like this. So just by holding the pen a little bit further back, whoop, all of a sudden, you get that, you can get that line. Now that's not something he would say, like, well, if you want to ink like Al Williamson, you know, he was not that type of artist. So it's sort of interesting to compare, like when I shared the studio with Al and I shared my studio many years with Ricardo Villagran. Ricardo was amazing with a brush. He inked everything with a brush, and you would swear it was a pen. But he would hold his brush like a pen. He would hold it up.
Villagran's incredible, I think. Yeah, I love his work.
Yeah, and he actually tried out for Prince Valiant years ago.
Oh, I'm lucky he didn't.
Back when Jay Kennedy was still,
yeah,
maybe because they were looking for people, I think, try out when Murphy maybe was starting to think about going. But you're right. It's not, you know, if you could find an old Spaniard or like Garcia Lopez or somebody like that, they've
got it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Modern cartoonists never have to draw horses. You know, when you really think about it.
So I've used assistants off and on over the years, you know, and there was a while there I was insecure about my layout, so I'd have the assistant lay it out for me or something like that. And I've also been heavily influenced by Wallace Wood and fascinated by the fact that he could have any number of people pencil a job for him. He'd get a job and give it to somebody else to draw it, and then he inks it and it's his. You know, he picks somebody who's going to do what he wants. I talked to Mike Zeck about this, and he said, well, you're doing what Wood wanted you to do. You're doing what, you know, you know what he wants because he tells you to do it, but then you draw it and then he inks it and it looks like a Wallace Wood drawing. So I've always been fascinated by that. So I will on occasion do that. And I'm working with a guy right now. Yes, Mark.
I'm sorry, everyone, but I'm afraid I got to split. I got to take care of this phone call that came in, and I didn't realize this would go on quite this long. It's I hate to go. It's been a lot of fun. But,
well, we can always have you back.
Thank you so much.
Well,
yeah.
Consider me interested in coming back. So,
great.
And I didn't know it was pronounced Thule. I thought it was Thule all this time. So thank you.
No, I did too for years. In fact, I think Thule sounds cooler than Thule, but it's Thule. There's no TH sound in the Germanic languages. It's a hard T.
Right.
That's great.
Right.
Well,
Okay,
Mark-
Mark, we'll see you in Camelot.
Thanks, everyone. Good meeting you. Good seeing you, Thomas. Good seeing you, Mike.
See
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So you were saying you were working with a younger.
Oh yeah,
artist.
yeah. I do have. There's a guy who's helping me out right now named Mel Ruby. He's younger than me. He still has some gray hairs, but he started off at Wildstorm, I think, with those guys, and he's really good. He lives nearby. I saw him at a convention, and I could tell by the way he drew that it had an old school academic approach underneath. The finishes are totally different finish, but I can, he can help me out and I'll do the finishes and it looks like my work and it's academically good. It's not, I got to fix the horses, but that's okay.
Well, guys, we're going to start wrapping up. It's a shame Mark had to go so soon to the end. But I wanted to throw maybe, Tom, 2 things at you, and then we'll see how it goes, and we'll get you out of here. Our good buddy Shelley, who's the artist with Dick Tracy. Look at this. It's a murderer's row of cartoonists up in here. Shelley asks, are you guys archiving for yourselves on the cloud, or like how are you archiving your work?
I just have it on my backup hard drives, back up my laptop regularly, and that's my archives. King has, everything because I know they have everything now because of the reprint books that are coming out. There's Fantagraphics that doing these fantastic reprints book. They've gone all the way through Foster. They're quite deep into the Murphy run. They're supposedly going to get to the stuff Mark and I have been doing in another 5 years or so. They're doing like 6 years of Prince Valiant years every year. And so the stuff is archived. The King archives it now. And there's a German and Spanish language and Portuguese language that I know of reprints of Mark and of Prince Valiant, of the current Prince Valiant. Every year they'll put it out in a really nice European volume. Some are the German one's a little bit oversized, and the color's good and the printing is good. And so King has the archives now. It's just when there was some periods in the past where they were a little loose about it, I think, and it's hard for them to find some stuff. But I think with the reprints going on, I think they're being pretty conscientious about it today.
And our last question, and then we're going to put everybody to bed. Our buddy EJB says, on a similar note, and perhaps a bit sacrilegious, have you ever been tempted to change the haircut?
Well, a little bit, my new assistant, Mel, can't seem to bring himself to draw that haircut, which I understand. And I did make him a bit shaggier when I took over. It's not quite as perfect. Every hair is not exactly in place, unless he's in the palace and dressed up and going to a banquet, maybe. But the wind is blowing it or something. But Foster had him something exploded in Prince Valiant's face one time, and part of his hair was burned off. So he actually looked like a Hollywood movie star at one point in Foster's because his hair was short. But no, I haven't.
That's great.
I had him grow a beard and get a little shaggy when he was in a dungeon for quite a while. That was fun.
Everybody needs a good dungeon beard once in a while.
That's right.
And didn't you assist Al for a few weeks on the Star Wars strip, I think, right?
I did. I assisted Al off and on a variety of projects, including Star Wars, from the time I met him in '78. Joe Kubert called me up and said, "Hey, Al Williamson's looking for a new assistant." Asked me if I knew anybody. Have you ever heard of Al Williamson? And yes, Joe. And so anyway, so Al called me. So he gave me each other's numbers, and I called and Al called, and I just had a ball talking to him. We really hit it off as friends more than art things. And he came down and got me, actually drove me back with his kids in his old sedan and drove me back to Callicoon, where he was living then. I met his second wife, Corey, was there, and I just loved Corey and the kids, and just had a blast. And pretty early on, then he started asking me to help on this or that or the other. First thing I did was pencil. So Carlos Garzon was Al's main assistant during that period. He was Al's assistant for a long time, and all through X9 and some other stuff later. And so Carlos his own job was drawing the Flash Gordon comic book that Gold Key was still publishing, and Al had asked me to pencil an issue of that when Carlos was behind. I penciled the Flash Gordon at Carlos, and I think Al and Victor De La Fuente, who was visiting, inked it. So and
that was fun, I bet.
It was very challenging. I was very green, but it was fun at the same time. It was fun, and I kind of learned some lessons. And King censored it. There was some Raymond swipes I put in that were too risque.
Oh.
Or Gold Key censored it, whoever.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we're gonna put a pin in it. Tom, thank you so much for Tom and Mark for your insight tonight. We would love to have both of you back, or one or two, or we'll take what we can get.
Talk about the Kubert School. Talk about Tarzan.
Yeah. There's a total part 2 in here if you're up to it.
Okay, well, when you run out of other more interesting ones,
Mike, you want to take us home?
Thanks. Okay. Well, thanks again. It was great going. Oh, I was going to show this before we go. This is a strip, an X9 strip that Al gifted me.
Oh wow!
Wow.
Tilt it a little bit, Mike. You got some glare on it.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's better. Yeah, it's better.
That's a gorgeous one. I remember. That's a great story. I remember that one. I have the reprint book of that. God, that stuff is. Look at the shape of those last panel of the trees and the plane going over.
Yeah. That's sort of what we were talking about in the beginning. I mean, that was his sense of design.
Yeah,
was so good.
Look at all that white
airplane flying and a bunch of leaves. Interesting.
Yes. Oh yeah. And then there's that incredibly dense drawing in the middle of the heroic figure against the heavily textured rock cliff, but then empty space where the guy's fallen through, and he's almost a silhouette.
Yeah. So beautiful. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I think is the most important thing that you can take away from people's work like that, like Foster's work. You can change the line weight, you can change the finish, you can change, you can put an anime line on it or a Disney line or whatever, but those other principles are what really make that stuff work. Not necessarily that person's drawing style. It's the principles underneath the drawing style. But thanks a lot. It was great going down memory lane a little bit. I remember the first time I met you was you were staying. I had come up to visit, and you were staying. You were sleeping downstairs in the cottage, the bottom of the.
Right at Williamson's place, yeah.
And there was like a million. I remember he had like all these old comic strips wrapped in tinfoil. Remember that? He had it with those old strips that he clicked over the years, and it was just like art everywhere. How could you sleep?
Yeah. It's incredible museum. His house was incredible. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Absolutely.
All right, my dog wants me to go.
Okay.
So, all right,
we will see you in the funny part.
I like that. All right. All right, Tom, we do a little thing on our way out. We're going to try to do it real quick. All right, you guys, we'll see you next week with more fun. Don't forget to wash those Kirby hands.
Those Kirby hands.
Put your hands up. There you go, Tom.
What would Jack Kirby do?
Yeah.
Hard to draw that.
Oh, there you go.
Going away, it's hard too. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. All right. Thank you guys so much. Let's see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.